Next, we've got Dr. Quinton Deeley from IOPPN, and I think really well placed to speak to us on free will and criminal responsibility. Dr. Deeley came into medicine with a humanities background, having studied theology and religious studies at Cambridge, and subsequently has specialised in a really wide area, including autism spectrum disorders and other neurodevelopmental disorders, dissociation, hypnosis. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here in person. So free will and criminal responsibility. Let's start with a quotation from an excellent review article by Patrick Haggard, who's of course done very important research in this area. He says, most adult humans have a strong feeling of voluntary control over their actions and of acting as they choose. The capacity for voluntary action is so fundamental to our existence that social constraints on it, such as imprisonment and prohibition of certain actions, are carefully justified and heavily regulated. Equally, disorders of voluntary action, such as abulia or psychosis, are features of many psychiatric and neurological conditions. So the point here, I think, from the very outset, the actual issue of free will is, as it stands in society, the law courts, actually also falls within the domain of neuropsychiatry, conditions which can affect the experience of the will. And so continue on with another quote from Haggard, and just to really now start to explore legal aspects of this. All legal systems have some concept of criminal responsibility. This concept asserts that healthy adults have a conscious experience and knowledge of their own intentions, actions, and outcomes that underpin their voluntary control of the action. Systems of law descending from Roman law use the term mens rea to describe this subjective intentional aspect of responsibility. In principle, therefore, someone who lacks a sense of agency regarding an action cannot be held criminally responsible for that action. And so in preparing this talk, I was given a copy of the relevant chapter in Archbold by a QC, Joe Stone, called The Mental Element in Crime. And one of the quotes there, which I thought was relevant here, it's been argued that to make a person liable to imprisonment for an offence which they do not know that they're committing and are unable to prevent is repugnant to the ordinary person's conception of justice and brings the law into contempt. And so one of the other observations about reading that chapter is about the evolving nature of legal concepts. And so, for example, we have the defence of provocation being recently replaced by a loss of control defence. In the case of prolonged domestic abuse, for example, we have the concept of diminished responsibility in murder, the Section 2 of the Homicide Act in 1957. And of course, we have the very familiar McNaughton rules dating from the 19th century, the Trial of Lunatics Act, a special verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. So just the legal concepts here, the party accused was labouring under a defect of reason from disease of the mind, not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know that what he was doing was wrong. So in other words, different features of an offence, of the subjective experience of committing offence are analysed, teased out by the law and considered as relevant to the issue of criminal responsibility. Now this is important. There's considerable variation in the application of these concepts to different types of offence. So Archbold says mens rea is a term which has no single meaning. Every crime has its own mens rea, which can be ascertained only by reference to its statutory definition or the case law. So I think in practice as a medical expert, essentially what we do is we address questions in our instructions that are put to us by lawyers, which define those aspects of the will or action that we need to evaluate in relation to the alleged offence. It's to reiterate Alan's point, actually, that we need to be doctors rather than advocates or barristers. So the question here, are there general principles from philosophical and neurocognitive accounts of free will which are relevant to legal notions of responsibility? So let's consider some of the philosophical aspects, and for this I'm going to switch to humanities mode of lecturing and read something out, but don't panic because there'll be some more PowerPoint slides. So this is from Daniel Dennett's very good book, Elbow Room, Varieties of Free Will, Worth Wanting, published in 1984. He says, ideas about causation were at the focus of attention in the early days of Greek philosophy, and it occurred to some to wonder whether all physical events are caused or determined by the sum total of all prior events. If they are, if, as we say, determinism is true, then every deed and decision is the inexorable outcome, it seems, of the sum of physical forces acting at the moment, which in turn is the inexorable outcome of the forces acting an instant before, and so on, to the beginning of time. So against this background and long debate in the history of philosophy, compatibilists believe that free will and determinism can be reconciled, whereas incompatibilists do not. So compatibilism was set out by Quine as follows. The freedom of the will means that we are free to do as we will. Not that our will is free to will as it will, which would be nonsense. We're free to do as we will unless someone holds us back or unless we will something beyond our strength and talent. Our actions count as free insofar as our will is a cause of them. Certainly the will has its causes in turn. No one could wish otherwise. If we thought wills could not be caused, we would not try to train our children, we would not try to sell things or to deter criminals. But compatibilism has its critics. So John Searle, in Minds, Brains and Science, wrote, the problem about freedom of the will is about whether or not the causes of our behaviour, whatever they are sufficient to determine the behaviour, so that things have to happen the way they do happen. The problem about compatibilism is then that it doesn't answer the question, could we have done otherwise, all other conditions remaining the same, in a way that is consistent with our belief in our own free will. Compatibilism, in short, denies the substance of free will while maintaining its verbal shell. Against this, Dennett argued in Elbow Room that the question of whether anyone could have done otherwise is not only unanswerable, its answer, even if you knew it, would be useless. Dennett states there could be no payoff in understanding to be gained by determining the micro-causation of the behaviour of a human being in some particular circumstance, since you will certainly never confront that micro-circumstance again. And even if you did, you would certainly be in a different reactive state at the time. Whatever could have done otherwise actually means it is not what we're interested in when we care about whether some act was freely and responsibly performed. The notion of freedom which Dennett here invokes is similar to that expressed by Quine, with the, to quote him, the actual causal chain of deliberation and choice running through the agent, as opposed to what he calls the rare situations of local fatalism, in which our deliberative machinery is actually disengaged from the trajectories that matter to us, such as, for example, if you fall off a bridge and you're travelling towards the water. The satisfaction of the metaphysical question of whether an agent could have done otherwise could not conceivably make any noticeable difference to the way the world went. For such an inquiry would have no relevance to making a discerning character assessment or planning for the future, which constitute the two common sense inquiries concerning the characteristic behaviour of an agent in a similar set of circumstances, which Dennett considers to be legitimate and answerable. So his comment about making a discerning character assessment points to how the question of whether a person could have done otherwise is also relevant to criminal responsibility. To hold a person morally and legally accountable entails that they ought not to have committed a specific offence. But ought implies can. So much hinges on what a person can and cannot do and its relevance to an offence in law. J.L. Austin considered the meaning of can and could with the example of missing a very short putt in golf and kicking himself because he could have holed it. Asking whether Austin could have holed a putt under conditions as they precisely were, the sense of can in particular micro-circumstances, is unknowable to the extent that answering would require the universe to be rerun. The useful and answerable meaning of can in general is whether Austin could have held the putt under very similar conditions. The answerable general sense of can is relevant to whether a person accused of a crime could have done otherwise. It means under the sorts of circumstances under which the crime is alleged to have occurred, given the characteristics of the accused, could they reasonably be expected to have done otherwise? For the expert witness, this means considering the characteristics of the accused in relation to the alleged offence and its circumstances. And we'll go on to consider some examples. Another area where philosophical discussion of free will has a potential bearing on criminal responsibility is experimental research on pre-conscious determinants of freely chosen actions, famously the experiment of Benjamin Libet. So just so that's the key paper. So Patrick Haggard summarised it. This classic paper showed that neural preparation for action precedes the conscious feeling of being able to act. Brain activity, therefore, causes conscious intention rather than the other way round. There's no ghost in the machine. Now, Dennett's compatibilist view in his book Freedom Evolves in 2003 was that the significance of these experiments had been overstated. Indeed, they'd been misinterpreted. As he put it, what Libet discovered was not that consciousness lags ominously behind unconscious decision, but that conscious decision-taking takes time. If you have to make a series of conscious decisions, you better budget half a second roughly for each one. And if you need to control things faster than that, you'll have to compile your decision-making into a device that can leave out much of the processing that goes into a standalone conscious decision. So against that background, let's now consider some of the evolving neuropsychiatric and cognitive perspectives on moral cognition and action as they have a particular bearing on the cause. So I hope you can see this diagram on the left. So this basically is taken from Haggard's article, and he calls it a naturalized model of human volition. And I suppose there are two key points I want to make here. One is that it takes volition, like any other cognitive function like memory or attention, and fractionates it into different processes hierarchically. But the other key point is that the implementation of the will is temporally extended. The processes occur in time. So if we start out here, we have these whether decisions, whether to perform a particular action, the motivations and reasons for action. And then we have how do we do that, what act do we perform to achieve the objective, a task selection, an action selection. Then there's a final predictive check in concrete circumstances, do we do the action, and then the performance of the action. But notice here these arrows, that it implies an iterative process. And notice also the time dimension. So let's think about that. There are different processes. So there's recursive processing in nested hierarchies. So this is a nested hierarchy. You've got the action, execution, it's embedded, it's the end of a series of processes. But the nested hierarchy, because human beings are embedded in time and in social relationships and institutions, also includes the institutional context, which is, of course, mediated by social cognition. So we have to expand our conception of what is involved in cognition in the formation of motives. But then there's the metacognitive element. So as Ram Haren Secord put it in 1972, humans, alone among animals, monitor their monitorings and hence their actions. So there's this continuous re-representation of our actions through time, which then feeds back into the adjustment of our goals, planning, and control. And of course, the time course of voluntary actions can extend from milliseconds to decades. For example, should I apply for a job? Should I resign from a job? Where should I live? Should I buy a house? Should I sell a house? Should I get married? Should I get divorced? Should I kill my neighbour? So they're all decisions which can evolve over many, many years. So what are the cognitive processes involved in immoral behaviour? This is an interesting study. It's quite rare to see a study of immoral behaviour, but this is a study by Roberts et al. And of course, they're talking about behaviour which violates moral precepts, moral norms. And of course, there are many processes which involve social perception, theory of mind, associative learning, response inhibition, empathic responses, aversion to harm, all have neuropsychological underpinnings and all potentially are constraints on freely chosen actions. And this is not something that we'll dwell upon, but it's just really to point out how variously implemented in different brain regions and networks those processes are. And of course now, in talking about these processes, we're really talking about the domain of social cognition, emotional cognition, motivation, moral cognition. We're not actually talking about the micro-mechanics of how a particular action is implemented over split-second timescales. That's a secondary consideration. So let's consider, for example, the case of psychopathy, anticipation of guilt about moral transgressions. So this paper by Sierra Cardozo et al. Says individuals with high levels of psychopathic traits seem to know what's wrong, but don't feel it to be wrong, and therefore fail to inhibit actions that may harm others. Now, of course, the neural underpinnings of that are better understood. But the point I wish to make here is that the fact that you know something is wrong, but don't feel it is wrong, is not a basis, in my view, for an insanity defense or diminished responsibility per se. Because knowing the wrongfulness of an action which you intend, at least in the sense that you know it's unlawful, is sufficient for criminal responsibility. Let's consider some case studies. So what about this case study of kleptomania following an acquired brain injury involving the frontal lobes? Here, the patient was unable to control the urge to steal. However, he also expressed feelings of guilt for his actions and kept stolen material hidden in his closet. This example of disinhibited behaviour points towards the inhibitory function of the inferior frontal gyrus, which, when damaged, is unable to prevent the impulsiveness associated with aspects of immoral behaviour, despite an understanding of what is and what is not appropriate. So I suppose this is an interesting case study. It also illustrates, of course, the difficulties of interpreting case studies, because, of course, it raises the question at what point in the evolution of an act is there a failure does a failure of inhibit occur? How is that mediated? So it might be a failure to modulate the motivational force of an impulse, which might implicate orbitofrontal cortex more, or the actual action inhibition, in which inferior frontal gyrus might be more involved. But again, it's just it's a reflection on the difficulty of interpreting single case studies. Loss of concern for actions. So how about this report of somebody with behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia in a hit and run, struck a van with passengers and continued to keep driving. When stopped by police a short distance away, the patient did not deny the accident had occurred, but expressed no concern for his actions. This behaviour may reflect damage to the insular and/or anterior cingulate cortex, as the patient did not empathically react to the passenger's responses of distress, nor the negative emotions they expressed. Therefore, didn't consider leaving the crime scene an immoral behaviour. So here, this is the effect on criminal motivation, or the failure to behave appropriately in response to one's own actions, due to a loss of emotion associated with actions. Of course, there's an interesting question here whether this is primarily influenced by a loss of emotion for others, empathy, or actually whether also some of the loss of emotion is a kind of abnormal fearlessness, a loss of feeling of fear or anxiety for the consequences, not caring about what the consequences of your actions are. So another frontotemporal dementia case, a person abandoned his 3-year-old grandchildren on an outing, suggesting they find their own way home in the dark. The patient showed no concern for the incident when later questioned, and stated that the children were capable of navigating home as they were familiar with the neighbourhood. This example of immoral behaviour points towards the impaired role of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is the patient was unable to make inferences about the mental states of his grandchildren, and instead reflected on and inferred his own capacity to return home safely. So this, I think, it is consistent with the theory of mind or perspective-taking problem, but it also raises the question whether there's a potential loss of the emotional weighting of representations of actions leading to impaired consequential thinking. So again, it may not be a single process which is impaired, or at least there are alternative explanations. So I'll just invite us to consider some conclusions, really. So free will, freely chosen actions, free will is realized in a cognitive control hierarchy comprising multiple interlinked processes operating across a range of timescales. Neuropsychiatric conditions potentially influence these processes and hence intention and behaviour. Legal reasoning about criminal responsibility varies with the alleged offence and is nuanced and complex. So the medical expert witness addresses the questions put to them in their instructions. I think in practice, we often rely on a form of reasoning by analogy, which links different types of evidence to determine whether the normal exercise of will, of decision-making, was critically compromised given the characteristics of the person and the circumstances of the alleged offence. So, what does that mean? So it's reasoning by analogy. So there's a general knowledge we have of a particular diagnosis, its characteristic features. There's the way features of that diagnosis are implemented or present in a particular individual. And then it's projecting that knowledge into how they might behave under particular circumstances. It's the use of other evidence, informant, collateral history. Neuropsychological testing is interesting here because neuropsychological testing is often used to substantiate inferences about a person's behavioural competencies under particular circumstances, but of course can also be limited in its applicability because of the difference between test conditions and the complexity of the real world. Two final points. Moral and legal accountability influences behaviour, which is a strong reason to avoid creeping exculpation, the idea that there is should be a relentless trend of not holding people responsible for their actions. And I think this is a very important point, is that treatment and rehabilitation can reduce reoffending, and so increases freedom of the will, the freedom to do otherwise. So Susie Young and colleagues did a study of ADHD in Aberdeen Prison, 200 inmates. They found a quarter of the inmate population had a history of childhood ADHD, and a quarter of those had untreated ADHD. And amongst those was a greatly elevated risk of adjudications of disciplinary offences, many of which are violent. So the point is that by treating those people, identifying and treating them, you're increasing their freedom not to have different options in addressing the problems that confront them in their life in prison, which includes not being violent. So, thank you very much.
That's great. Does anybody have any questions? Professor Koppelman there, have you got the microphone? Can you pass over? Oh, go on.
Quinton, that was a very nice talk. Look, neuropsychiatry in a way muddies the waters. What do you make of the view of some legal philosophers that there's almost a category confusion between a causal deterministic science on the one hand and this is Stephen Mawson, Dennis Patterson and others, and the law which thinks in terms of reason and intention, and it's almost a category confusion. It's a muddle. Now, as I say, neuropsychiatry is muddying the water. But do you think that that view is helpful or a cop-out?
Well, I think, human beings are complicated and organised at different levels. So there's the realm at which the level at which we experience our behaviour, which we describe in psychological terms of motives, and reasons for actions and all of that. And we've got all of this chemistry and electricity going on at our heads at the same time, and they're causally interlinked. And I think our job is to understand what the reciprocal relationships between those levels of organisation are and embed that within the world as well, within social relationships and so on. So I don't think, at least correlationally, I don't think there's a problem there. There's a harder question about how particular mental state terms should be consistently understood to be grounded in particular brain states, and how to manage the way that to hybridize those discourses so that they're coherent. I accept that, but not impossible in principle. But I don't think there's a sort of magical solution to it. I think it's a piecemeal type of process in relation to particular sorts of questions that are put to us.
Thank you. Any other questions? There. Thanks.
Thanks. I was just wondering if you could argue philosophically if you could kind of strengthen free will with pharmacology. So in someone with ADHD, would they have more free will if they were treated with methylphenidate compared to someone without? And then the kind of consequences on the justice system for that.
Oh yeah, great. I was trying to, because it's a bit confusing actually with the speaker system. Yes, well, so one framework for thinking about the freedom of the will is that it's increased the more that association cortices have evolved. In other words, the intermediary processing between ambient stimuli and behavioural output, that free will is part of the complex, the product of the complex behavioural cognition motivating behaviour which intervenes between those two events. And obviously we have these enormously hypertrophied cerebral cortices as a consequence of human evolution, and therefore we have what we call free will. So if you make behaviour less stimulus driven, like the patient, like the prisoner in Aberdeen prison who's hitting people when they tread on their toe or look at them for too long, then you're increasing their free will. So yes.